Rich relatives laughed at the poor bride, but when her husband took the microphone, everything changed. Liam and Emma's wedding day promised to be the event of the year. The luxurious hall in the old mansion was decorated with thousands of white roses, huge crystal chandeliers reflected the light of candles, and the soft golden light of the sunset spilled outside the window. The guests, dressed in expensive suits and gowns, had already begun to gather around the long, perfectly set tables. Emma stood in front of the mirror in the small preparation room, lightly adjusting her veil. Her dress, though modest, looked perfect, neat cut, pearl buttons along the back. Her face shone with soft beauty, but there was a slight worry in her eyes. "Are you ready?" her friend and only guest on the bride's side, Sarah, asked. Emma nodded, though everything in her chest clenched with excitement. "Everything will be fine," Sarah reassured her, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to be priced like a commodity on the market. At the other end of the mansion, in the spacious groom's room, Liam was finalizing the last preparations. His expensive suit fit perfectly, but he didn't feel his usual confidence. The complicated relationship with his family had long worn him down, but he knew today would be a test not only for him, but for Emma as well. "Are you sure about this?" his brother John asked, sipping a glass of champagne. "Absolutely," Liam replied, not hesitating for a second. "Well, your fiancée is nice, but she's not our type," John continued with a smirk. Liam clenched his teeth but remained silent. The wedding ceremony went flawlessly. Emma walked down the aisle, feeling the stares of the guests drilling her. Some smiled, but many looked on with curiosity and slight judgment. "She's too plain for him," one of Liam's aunts whispered to her neighbor. "Look at her dress, clearly not designer," another added. Emma heard these whispers, but tried to focus on Liam. His eyes radiated warmth and confidence, and that was the only thing that gave her the strength to go on. After the ceremony, the guests dispersed around the room, enjoying cocktails and hors d'oeuvres. Emma tried to be polite, but it was as if her every movement was being scanned. "How nice of you to decide to marry Liam," one of the cousins said, pulling on a fake smile. "Thank you," Emma replied briefly, feeling increasingly awkward. Liam noticed Emma tensely talking to his relatives. He walked over to her, put his arm around her waist, and whispered, "You're doing great. Remember, we're here for us, not them." Those words calmed her a little, but she knew the evening was just beginning. When Emma was a little girl, she often looked out the window of her room at the neighbor's house where her best friend lived. The house with its neatly mowed lawns, flower beds, and sparkling windows seemed like a world she could never enter. Her family's life was very different, a small house with a gnarled fence, a mother who worked 3 jobs, and a constant struggle to survive. Her father left when Emma was 5 years old, leaving her mother with 2 children. "You have to be strong, Emma," her mother used to tell her when the girl complained that she didn't have a new dress for a school night. Emma learned to be strong. She cleaned the house, helped her mom, and took care of her little brother. But there was always room in her heart for a dream. "Someday I'll get out of here," she told herself before going to sleep, looking at the worn walls of her room. The school years were not easy. Emma was a good student, but never felt on par with her classmates. She wore second-hand clothes, rarely went to parties, and knew her family could never afford expensive gifts or trips. After graduating from high school, she went straight to work. Her first job was as a waitress at a local diner. There she learned to tolerate rude customers and maintain a smile even if it was hard on her heart. But she didn't give up. She took night classes and after a few years was able to become a nurse. This job allowed her to help her family and feel at least a little bit that her life was starting to improve. Meeting Liam came as a complete surprise to her. They met at the hospital where Emma worked. Liam had come to visit his friend who had been in a car accident. "You're the most caring nurse I've ever seen," he told her with a warm smile. Emma was embarrassed. She wasn't used to compliments, especially from such an attractive man. At first she thought he was just flirting. But Liam kept coming over, even when his friend had recovered. He brought her coffee, told her funny stories and gradually became part of her daily life. Their relationship grew slowly but surely. It took Emma a long time to believe that a man from a different social background could be truly interested in her. "You're special," Liam said when he saw her doubts. "I'm just an ordinary girl," she replied. "Not to me, you're not." When Liam proposed, Emma didn't immediately say yes. "Are you sure?" "Your family, they'll never accept me," she said, looking him in the eye. "I don't care what they think. What matters is that we're together," he replied firmly. Those words were a ray of light for her in her complicated life. The moment Liam informed his family of the impending wedding, there was a sepulchral silence in the house. His father, Richard, folded his arms across his chest and slowly said, "You want to marry a girl who works as a nurse? Is that the best you can do?" Liam's mother, Margaret, lowered her eyes, not daring to contradict her husband. "She's a good girl, Dad," Liam said firmly. "Good? Being nice isn't enough. You could have picked someone from your circle. We're talking about the future of our family." Emma had sensed that her relationship with Liam's family was not going to be easy, but she hadn't expected such blatant disregard. Even before the wedding, she'd had to deal with their coldness. When she'd gone to her first family meeting, she'd felt like the whole house was against her. "Emma, will your parents be at the wedding?" One of the cousins, Sophie, asked with a fake smile. "My mom's coming, but my dad, he's not with us," Emma replied, feeling the color flood her cheeks. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know," Sophie said, but her tone gave away that she knew and wanted to embarrass Emma. Every family event was a challenge. Liam's aunts discussed her behind her back and Liam's father made no secret of his displeasure. "It's just a phase, he'll come to his senses soon," Richard told his brother, but Liam overheard the words casually. "Maybe you should learn to respect my choices," he threw, looking directly at his father. "You have no idea what you're talking about. This marriage will ruin your career and reputation," Richard replied without losing his cool. Emma tried to keep her dignity, but she was having a hard time. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner, she burst into tears. "I don't know why you want me. Your family hates me," she said, sitting on the edge of the bed. Liam knelt down in front of her, took her hands and said quietly, "I love you. Not them. And I'll never let them ruin what we have." Those words were her only support, but she knew the real trials were yet to come. As the wedding approached, the tension only increased. Richard was openly stating that he wouldn't fund the celebration if Liam continued to insist on his choice. "I don't need your money, Dad," Liam replied, and that was the final straw for his father. Margaret, trying to save face, still supported her son, but her stance was passive. "Liam, you're making a big mistake," she said quietly, but her words were drowned out by his determination. Emma, without knowing all the details, felt she was becoming the cause of the rift. She tried to be inconspicuous, but her every appearance at family gatherings elicited whispers and leering glances. "Did you see her dress at the engagement party? So modest, like she's going to a high school prom," one relative whispered. Emma heard every word, but didn't show how hurt she was. "I won't let them see how weak I am," she repeated to herself. Liam and Emma's wedding was supposed to be a day of happiness, but for Emma it started with labored breathing and cold sweats. The large mansion was full of guests, most of whom were from the groom's side of the family. They seemed to her like people from another world, expensively dressed, confident, with an unspeakable coldness in their eyes. "You look gorgeous today," Sarah said, trying to encourage her friend as they stood in front of the large mirror in the prep room. "Thank you," Emma replied with a smile that was cracking at the seams from the strain. Her dress was modest, but it fit perfectly. It wasn't from a famous designer, but to her it symbolized her best dreams. However, she knew that for some of the guests, it would just be another reason for ridicule. All day long, Emma felt like she was being judged. "Did you hear that? Her family couldn't even pay half the expenses," one of Liam's cousins, Sophie, said loudly during cocktail hour. Emma tried to stay away from such talk, but they found a way to get to her ears, as always. When the formal part began, she felt the stares of the guests literally falling on her. During her first speech, when she thanked Liam's family for their support, someone in the audience could barely contain a chuckle. "Support? What kind of support? We're the ones dragging this whole circus," she heard whispered from the front row. But the real pain came during dinner. As the guests were seating themselves at the tables, one of Liam's aunts decided to comment on Emma's ring. "How dainty," she said with an artificial smile. "Must be an antique? It looks modest." "It's perfect for us," Emma replied quietly, but there was a twinge of resentment in her voice. Auntie nodded, as if with regret, and turned to her roommate, adding quietly, "She sure saved money on everything." Liam noticed her faded gaze, but she quickly averted her eyes, trying to hide her feelings. The climax of the evening came when the toasts began. One of Liam's relatives, known for his sarcastic sense of humor, rose to say a few words. "Well, Liam," he began with a smirk, "you surprised us all. No one expected you to pick someone so unusual." The hall laughed, but that laughter was more like a giggle that cut to the soul. Emma could feel her cheeks burning. "But maybe that's what you need. Someone needs to keep their feet on the ground," he finished, which caused another wave of chuckles. Emma lowered her head, trying not to show the tears coming to her eyes. Liam sat beside her, his fists clenched until they were white. He could feel his patience running out, but he tried to save face for Emma's sake. When the waiters started serving dessert, Emma whispered quietly to him. "I'm fine. Don't worry." But he knew she was lying. "You don't have to put up with this," he replied quietly. Emma tried to smile, but her smile was too strained to seem real. All evening, Liam had watched his family and guests continue to humiliate Emma under the guise of harmless jokes. But he saw every tremor, every attempt to hide her resentment behind a smile. And with each passing moment, his patience was wearing thin. When one of the guests, Cousin John, decided to make his toast, Liam felt it would be the last straw. "Let's raise our glasses to Liam," John began, holding his own as if casually. "You've always been the unexpected guy. No one expected you to choose, well, let's just say such an unusual bride." The hall erupted into quiet laughter, but Liam wasn't laughing. "Emma, you sure know how to surprise our family," John continued, sipping from his glass. "I'm sure in time you'll learn how to behave in such circles." Those words burned the air, and Liam rose abruptly from his seat. "That's enough," he said loudly, silencing the hall. Emma looked at him anxiously. "Liam, please don't," she whispered, but he was already determined. He walked over to the microphone standing in the center of the hall and tapped it to get everyone's attention. "Dear guests," he began, his voice sounding firm and clear. "I am grateful that you have come to celebrate our special day. But I cannot remain silent when I see what is happening." There was a tense silence in the hall. "I've heard a lot of jokes directed at my wife today. And you know what, those jokes say more about you than they do about her. Emma clasped her hands together, not knowing how to respond. Liam continued. You speak of her simplicity, of being out of our circle. But let me remind you what it means to be part of our circle. It means being willing to betray anyone for status, looking down on others, and believing that money defines a man. Voices in the audience murmured, but no one dared to interrupt. Emma is the most sincere, honest, and kind woman I've ever met. She doesn't try to get you to like her because she doesn't need your approval. She's already proven her worth through deeds, not words. He looked at his parents. You want to know why I chose her? Because she taught me something you could never do. She taught me to love, to forgive, and to see people for what they truly are. She taught me that dignity isn't measured in money. Emma felt tears welling up in her eyes. Liam turned to the others. And if any of you think she's not right for this family, you're probably right. Because I don't want her to become part of your world of arrogance and judgment. Instead, I want us to create our own world together, where there is no room for hate and prejudice. The hall froze. No one dared to utter a word. Some guests averted their eyes, others stared at him in amazement. Emma, barely containing her emotions, stood up and walked over to him. Thank you, she whispered, wrapping her arms around him. Her voice shook, but they were tears of relief and gratitude. Liam stood with the microphone in his hand, his gaze focused and his voice sounding confident. He knew that the moment he had avoided for so long had arrived. His family, his guests, and even Emma all froze, waiting for him to continue. I want to tell you a story, he began, taking a deep breath. A story about a man who spent his life trying to live up to the expectations of others. Emma, standing next to him, frowned slightly. She realized that Liam was talking about herself. Ever since I was a child, I was indoctrinated that success was about wealth, status, and the external picture of the perfect life. I've had every chance to achieve it. But you know what I've always lacked? Real love, understanding, human intimacy. Liam looked at his parents, whose faces had become tense. We had everything in our house, luxury, dinners with important guests, expensive things. But there was one thing that wasn't there, sincerity. I learned to smile when I wanted to shout, and to agree when I wanted to say no. He was silent for a moment, letting everyone comprehend his words. Then one day I met Emma. She wasn't trying to impress, she wasn't pretending. She was just being herself. Her simplicity, her honesty, her desire to help others was everything I'd never seen in our surroundings. Emma felt her eyes fill with tears again. When I decided I wanted to spend my life with her, I knew it wouldn't be easy. I knew you, my family, would start comparing her to what you think is ideal. But you know what I realized? Your ideal is empty. The hall began to whisper restlessly, but no one dared interrupt him. Emma showed me that love isn't about status or money. It's about mutual support, honesty, and the ability to see things in a person that are hidden from view. He turned to Emma and took her hand. I chose her because she changed my life. She showed me that a man's real worth is his heart, not his bank account. And I'm proud that she's my wife now. Liam looked at his guests, his voice harder. If any of you think Emma isn't good enough, I want to ask, what have you done to prove you're enough? How are you better than her? By wearing expensive clothes and sitting in expensive houses? She saves lives every day, helps people, works harder than any of you. The hall grew quiet. Now, if anyone thinks I made the wrong choice, you can get up and leave. But I will never give it up for your approval. Those words hung in the air like a stroke of thunder. The faces of the guests became tense, some clearly uncomfortable. Richard, Liam's father, looked like he was ready to explode, but Margaret looked at her son with a kind of pride for the first time in a long time. Emma stood next to Liam, her voice quiet but firm. "Thank you, Liam. You've always been there for me, even when I doubted myself. And today I want to tell everyone, I love this man. Not for his money, not for his family, but for always being himself. Thank you for accepting me, even if you didn't immediately realize who I was." Liam smiled at her and the hall seemed to freeze for a moment. After Liam and Emma's words, the hall fell into a sepulchral silence. Some avoided looking in their direction, some looked away in embarrassment, and some of the guests were still trying to maintain a semblance of indifference. Richard, Liam's father, sat with a stony expression on his face, but it was clear from the tension in his jaw that he could barely contain his irritation. He wasn't used to anyone, especially his son, challenging his judgment. Margaret, Liam's mother, lowered her eyes, but a shadow of understanding flickered in her gaze. Perhaps for the first time in a long time, she thought about the fact that her son had finally found his happiness despite their family traditions. An awkward cough resounded among the guests. No one knew how to react to such a frank speech by the groom. Sophie, Liam's cousin, who used to discuss Emma the loudest, nervously adjusted her dress and whispered to her neighbor. "Well, that was unexpected." Her neighbor nodded, hesitant to respond. Suddenly, one of Liam's distant relatives, an older man with gray hair, rose slowly. He was holding a glass of champagne, his eyes focused on the bride and groom. "You know," he began with a huskiness in his voice, "I've watched this family for many years. And I mean, today is the first time I've seen any of us tell the truth." All heads turned toward him. "Liam, you're a real man. You made a choice based on love, not money or status. And I'm proud of you." Those words caused many to lower their eyes. Another aunt who hadn't stood out from the crowd before followed. "Emma, I want to apologize for my words and thoughts. I only saw you as your status, not who you really are. Liam's right, we've spent too long valuing the wrong things that really matter." Emma, who hadn't expected the support, looked at her appreciatively, but still cautiously. Not all the guests supported the change in mood, however. Richard rose slowly and cast a glance at Liam. "You think you're going to change anything with your words? You've forgotten where you are and who you are. This marriage is your mistake." Those words were spoken with icy coldness. Liam held his gaze. "If it's a mistake, Dad, it's the one mistake I'll never regret making." Richard turned and, without another word, left the hall. The guests began to discuss what had happened in whispers. Some were condemning Liam's act, but most seemed to be beginning to realize how badly they had underestimated him and Emma. Margaret walked over to Emma and said softly, "I'm sorry this all happened, but please let me get to know you better. You have made my son happy and I can see that." Emma was taken aback but only managed a nod, unable to find the words. The evening continued, but the atmosphere had changed. The wedding, which started as an ostentatious event, turned into a more sincere and warm event. People became more attentive to words and actions, and Emma felt for the first time that she wasn't a complete stranger in the room. After Richard left the room, a strange mixture of relief and tense silence hung in the atmosphere. The guests continued to whisper, but their conversations were less venomous now than they had been at the beginning of the evening. Liam and Emma returned to their table, but their presence was now perceived very differently. Margaret, Liam's mother, approached them cautiously, clutching a glass of champagne in her hands. Her face expressed a complex mixture of emotions, pride, embarrassment, and perhaps a little guilt. "Liam, Emma," she began, stopping in front of them. "I want to apologize. We often forget that our children's happiness should come first. Liam, you proved today that you are a real man. And you, Emma, you deserve to be a part of this family. Emma looked at Margaret, not knowing how to respond. Those words meant more to her than she could express. Thank you, she finally whispered, her voice trembling with the emotions overwhelming her. The dance floor was empty, but Liam, noticing this, decided to change things up. He stood up and held out his hand to Emma. Mrs. Liam, shall we dance? She smiled at him and, forgetting everything, put her hand in his. As they stepped onto the floor, the music started to play and Liam put his arm around her like they were the only ones in the room. Their movements were light and sincere, as if the whole world had ceased to exist. The guests began to applaud. Some even joined in the dance, and those who had recently scoffed now looked on with respect and perhaps envy. By the end of the evening, Emma felt different. She was no longer just the poor girl that everyone judged. She had become Liam's wife, the woman he had fought for and chosen despite all the obstacles. Sarah, her friend, approached her as the guests began to disperse. You made it through, Emma. And you know what? You proved to everyone that you deserve better, she said as she hugged her. Emma smiled, feeling relieved for the first time all day. When the guests dispersed, Liam and Emma were left alone in the empty hall. Well, Mrs. Liam, he said, looking at her with a warm smile. From now on, it's just beginning. She laughed, but tears of happiness glistened in her eyes. Yes, it's starting. And you know what? I'm ready. This wedding was the beginning of a new chapter for both of them. Liam proved that love and sincerity could be more important than status and money. Emma gained confidence in herself and realized that her strength is not in where she came from, but in who she is.